Welcome to the Orange and Black Insider Bengals podcast. I'm Anthony Cosenza, and I'm joined by my two partners in crime. We thought it was going to be a party of two initially, but we've got our third member, Connor Howe. How are you?
I'm good, man. Just trying to not sweat as much as I was like 3 minutes ago.
Okay, I don't know if I'll ask why, but
Like 98 degrees here, that's why.
I'm glad you're not. So
Under the desert,
if
man.
I see you dabbing your forehead, I know what's going on. So good to have you here. Scott Schulte is here as well, over on the East Coast time. Scott, how you doing? I know you got a lot of things on your plate.
Yep, still awake, so that's a good thing.
Yeah, well that's good. That's good. We're gonna try and keep the energy level up to keep you awake. So let's get started. We've got a lot to dive into this week. Obviously, the regular season is around the corner. The Bengals have been going through preseason. They went through what is commonly seen as the dress rehearsal, where their starters get the most significant time in a preseason game. And let's talk about that briefly because we do have a lot to get to. Connor, I'll start with you. Give me some impressions and some overall, maybe one positive and one negative you can take out of the team and their 26-21 loss in Jacksonville on Sunday night.
Well, let's just say that Sunday night was anything but a loss for the Bengals. I mean, they had three. The story of the night's going to be, oh, they had three guys who got like dinged up. Obviously they lost Pierman, and that was, I think, a lot bigger than most of us realize, just because he plays such a huge impact on special teams. But aside from that, man, everything looked good. The interior offensive line was dominant from top to bottom, with Clint Bowling, Kevin Zeitler, and Russell Bodine all looking really good. Bowling and Zeitler were pulling on blocks really well, and Bodine was connecting with people in a way that he usually hasn't done before. So hopefully he's able to keep that up. He looked, the first game he was pretty like below average. Second game he was right at average or a little bit better. The third game he's been really good. So hopefully that just continues, and hopefully he has progressed to the point where he's at the level where Paul Alexander's been raving him up to. So that was good. And I mean, the negative, if anything, I guess, obviously the Pierman injury hurts. If I'm going to take a negative away from the play, I'm probably going to go, and obviously the reserves were really frustrating to watch too. They weren't very good. But I'll go with I still am not a fan of the whole safety situation. I think we saw Iloka's great. Iloka hasn't even been tested at all throughout the preseason, which has been great. It's just a testament to how really fantastic he is as a player. I think that Sean Williams is really good in the run game, and Duron Smith is really good against the pass, but both of them lack in the respective area that they don't excel in. So Smith isn't a great run defender, and Sean Williams isn't as great in coverage as he probably should be to be a starting NFL safety. So hopefully those things are able to adjust themselves out, and Smith and Williams can work with each other and try to work off each other's strengths, and that Gunther can utilize them in the scheme. But ultimately, that's kind of my take.
Yeah, it's a good point about the starters because I mean in all three games the starters looked pretty well. I mean even though the Bengals are 1-2 in the preseason, they played pretty well against the Vikings in the opener. They really played well against Detroit. And then they had a 21-3 lead against Jacksonville that they saw evaporate, as you mentioned. So, Scott, overall impressions, maybe a positive and a negative takeaway, aside from obviously the Pierman injury. We're going to talk a little bit more about that in a minute, but positive and negative for you in preseason game number 3.
Yeah, I'd say overall, one thing I think a lot of people don't really or haven't really focused on is this was actually a primetime game. And one of the knocks on Bengals and on Dalton is, hey, it's primetime, they melt. And granted, it's preseason, but it was kind of cool. It was a primetime game Sunday night on national TV, and the starters looked really good. And on the starters, especially the defense, that was probably the one takeaway that I really liked was seeing this team as much publicity as they get, with Eifert, with Dalton, with the two-headed running back, with AJ Green. The defense is kind of one of the things that really sets them up. And the defense just, for 2 straight weeks has looked great against Detroit and against Jacksonville. And that was one thing I mentioned last week. I was very curious to see how would this defense look against a good young offense. A lot of people are really hyping up the Jaguars with Bortles kind of coming into his own last year. There's 2 good young wide receivers. And for the most part, the starters pretty much shut him down. Bortles had 16 attempts and 52 yards. That's like 3 yards an attempt. They're 3 point something, which is pretty pitiful. And then the big running back they bring in, Chris Ivory, had 4 rushes for 4 yards. So yeah, the the defense definitely looked like they stepped up. They're ready for the regular season. So that's very encouraging to see. The negative, if any, which Connor alluded to, would have to be the backups. Like we were up, 14-3, 21-3, and then next, they lost the game. And part of it, yeah, it's backups. Yeah, it's guys who may not make the 53-man roster, but still, you'd like to see more from your backups instead of going 2 for 9, passing with like 18 yards and a pick. Not exactly.
Not ideal.
Yeah, those numbers pretty much look like the San Francisco starters, which isn't a good thing. But
It's always
yeah,
meant to
I'd
be the
say
Jags were the hottest preseason team of the year before the Bengals. I mean, they destroyed the starters to the point where Bortles had one of the funniest in-game interviews I've seen in a long time, and he was just like, "Oh, we suck." But but yeah, I mean, they were hot before they played Cincinnati, so it was cool to see.
yeah, I mean that was definitely the best thing to see the defense. See what would they do against Allen Robinson and Allen Hurns, and the answer was they shut him down. Defensive backs didn't really have to do a bunch because the pressure was there. They kind of, I mean, the whole defensive unit just looked good. So very promising. Here, obviously, in 2 weeks, we're hoping it continues. But yeah, biggest takeaway defense. Worst takeaways, yeah, our third, fourth string quarterbacks. But hopefully, it never comes to that.
Exactly. Good stuff from both of you. I'm gonna go a little different route. And kind of go a little bit more on an individual basis. I do agree that the starters on both sides of the ball did a great job, and I do agree, Connor, that the offensive line, especially some of the weaker links, the Bodines and others, looked good, and you saw them pull out on that Giovanni Bernard kind of screen pass and pave the way for him. You saw Jeremy Hill get some nice runs. I'm going to say the positive and go a little specific. One guy that kind of stood out to me was Dre Kirkpatrick on the defense, and you guys mentioned that those 2-star wideouts that the Jaguars have didn't really have awesome nights. Blake Bortles, I think you said, what was it, Scott, 52 yards or something just kind of absurd. And Dre Kirkpatrick, if you remember, had a nice tip, a very, very nice play in the end zone where he tipped away a ball on a fade route to a wide receiver, and that was a very impressive play, and he did a lot of that last year, but it was something that you really saw the development and the growth in this year, and you saw why the Bengals drafted him because of that length he has and how he can knock away a lot of passes. Even though Jeremy Hill looked good and had a couple of nice runs, including that very acrobatic 1-yard touchdown run, I'm going to say the inability to still get those tough 1-yard runs, and even though he scored on that play, you notice he had to bounce it outside and really struggle to get it into the end zone. And 3 runs before that, from the 1 or 2 yard line, the team could not punch it into the end zone up kind of the middle part of the line. So while they were good at pulling and getting some stuff in space and getting blocks in space, there were some issues on, as the team got in those short yardage situations with their power back, and that was a little frustrating to see. So those are our positive and negatives. It looks
I gotta
like
throw in AT. That Drake Kirkpatrick pass breakup, man, that was reminiscent of the Richard Sherman on Michael Crabtree play.
Yep, exactly.
He sprawled out for that one. And besides that, he never even gets targeted, man. He's been playing well this preseason. I think people are sleeping on him.
Yeah, there needs to be growth this year. Obviously, he didn't have any turnovers last year as a full-time starter, which was kind of an anomaly because as a spot starter and a backup, the couple of years prior, he had, I think, 6 total interceptions and 2 returns for touchdowns or something absurd like that. So, he's got the athleticism. He just, I think, needs to start living up to expectations this year, especially with some of the injuries at the cornerback spot. You hope he raises his play this year. So those are kind of the impressions from preseason game number 3, the dress rehearsal from all of us. Quickly, guys, I'm going to circle it back around. Scott, the preseason game 4 is one where the starters barely play, if at all. You don't want to risk injuries, and especially with how many the Bengals have already had this year. So what players are you going to be looking at in preseason game 4 that might be clinging to a roster spot or fighting for a final roster spot?
I'd say on offensive side, I'm going to stick with several people that we've kind of been talking about on the podcast all during training camp, which is Simon Eyes and Kumaro, because I just want to see them play. I mean, they just really haven't been on the field. I just want to, and we've kind of seen with Erickson, we've kind of seen how this wide receiver core is starting to shape up. We're kind of seeing, some of the guys getting cut, some of the guys who are kind of looking like they're staying, and I think Simon Eyes and Kumar are kind of two bubble guys who might be practice squatters, but this would kind of be the chance because you figure they're not going to play Boyd, they're not going to play LaFell, they're not going to play Green. This is, and now they've cut some of the lower tier, this is where those middle tier guys are really going to get their chance. And so I'd say the one of the two things I want to see is those wide receivers that we've kind of been talking about all preseason and somewhat off season is, how is that? How are we going to finally shape that post Marvin Jones, Mohamed Sanu roster? And then the other thing I want to see is Russell Bodine's backups, who probably could be his replacements on any other team. But I'd like to see, with some of the guys they've been looking at, as far as his, I guess, the second, third stringers, to see if Cooper or someone, T.J. Johnson, do they look any better, and will they give a chance to someone like a Westerman to play center, or are they just going to stick him at guard, and someone like Trey Hopkins? Are they going to? Because I think both Hopkins and Westerman would be really good guards, and they could be good centers. So I'd just like to see, what are they going to do at the interior line? How are they going to look? Granted, they're going to be playing backups, but it'd still be nice to see. Does it look like we have something? Do the fans have something to kind of look forward to kind of get excited about if the team should, ever decide to move on from Bodine? And as crazy as that sounds, as we saw with Tate, it's possible. So there's always hope for Bengals.
Yeah, yeah. So unfortunately, T.J. Johnson, I think, if you remember last week, was responsible for a bad snap. I think it was to A.J. McCarron that led to a fumble. So he didn't have a great showing last week. And if you're asking me, I think the best bet for someone that's currently on the roster to possibly supplant Russell Bodine at some point would be Christian Westerman, but who has played well this preseason, but we'll see.
And he is the bench press.
Yeah, he's a fellow bench press king. That's right, absolutely. Connor, give me a couple of guys you're looking at in preseason week 4 as the team rests its starters and gears up for the regular season.
How about P.J. Dawson, man? Where has he been? I don't even know. He's been invisible.
Great point.
I don't know if the Bengals just don't want to play him, if he's on the field and I just don't see him. And I mean, it's crazy because, the backups, Vigil's been okay at best. He's been on the field and fans see him and they're saying, oh, he's making tackles. But he's not making he's not doing anything spectacular. And that's not to say that Vigil can't be good. But as of right now, he isn't in shape to potentially be the backup middle linebacker. So where's P.J. Dawson? And I think along those same lines, we saw Jason DeMonch got cut, which is kind of, I'm guessing, is going to lead to Marquise Flowers starting the season on the roster. I'd love to see Marquise Flowers. I saw him on a couple plays last game. I think one on special teams. He also, I believe, made just a normal tackle. And just those guys. I mean, the linebacking position is something where there's really not much happening there. So that'd be something interesting. I'll throw in another one. But I think, as Scott said, the receiver position is definitely something to keep an eye on. You mentioned Simon Eyes and Kumaro. I had a Twitter follower who was adamant about the fact that Alonzo Russell is going to start on the team. Not just make the team, not make the practice squad, but no, he's going to start. And you don't know anything if he's not going to start. I'm not trying to call out.
I'm at a loss on that one. I'm at a loss of words on that one.
If you start the game on special teams on a kickoff, and he's on kickoff coverage, could be a starter. I
don't know, man. But like you said, Scott, it's such an enticing competition. You have Simon, Kumaro, and Russell. All three of them are 6'4", 6'5". All of them run 4.4, 4.5, 40, something along those lines. I think Simon Eyes has the most upside of the three because I just think his agility plays such a big factor, even if he doesn't have the greatest hands of the bunch. And he doesn't have bad hands or anything, but I think that lateral agility is something where teams will definitely covet. So those big receivers, man, I'd love to see one of them, I think none of them are going to push for a roster spot, I don't think, at this point, but I'd love to see two of those three end up on the practice squad, and I hope that they're able to earn that shot rather than just end up there.
I'll be looking at a couple of spots, and I'm going to sound like a bird on one guy because I think I've said it the last 2 or 3 games now. But CJ Uzuma, you need to start stepping up, buddy. I mean, you've got so many injuries at the tight end spot, and with the huge shoes to fill with Tyler Eifert, Uzuma has done little to nothing in the preseason. There was an incompletion to him this last week. He had kind of a drop in the first preseason game. I did notice on that Giovanni Bernard screen pass that Uzama did seal off a guy on the very edge. I think it was a defensive back. So that was nice to see, especially because he has a little bit more of a reputation as an athletic pass catcher than a blocker. But even though Brandon LaFell did some nice things last week, Tyler Boyd's been impressing this preseason. You've got a couple of other receivers who have been making plays. Uzama needs to start showing that the team can lean on him in this offense in the absence of Tyler Eifert. So I sound like a broken record. I'm sure I could probably record it and put it on this, take a recording from past episodes and put it on this one. But that's a guy that needs to start making plays. And even though he may not get a ton of time if he is the starter this week, the Bengals need to be able to rely on him in some capacity early on this season. So that's one guy I'm looking at. I'm also going to be looking at the backup running back position. And, we've now, and we'll talk about this in just a second, but Cedric Pierman broke his forearm in the game, unfortunately, and I hope he gets well. I hope he comes back. If you have been a Bengals fan for a number of years, you know what a high-quality, high-character guy Cedric Pierman is. He does all the dirty work on special teams. He's a backup running back. He never gets heralded. He did make one Pro Bowl finally, which was well-deserved. So Cedric Pierman, get well soon. But the Bengals are going to keep 4 running backs, and Hill and Bernard are going to be there. Burkhead is now going to be there. So who's going to be that 4th running back that they keep? Is it Trey Carson? Is it some of these other guys that have been, doing some things in this preseason that they'll keep as the 4th back, especially because two talented guys they had last year, James Wilder Jr. and Terrell Watson, were picked up by the Browns and the Bills respectively there. So the team needs to find another running back. So those are kind of the areas that I'll be looking at there. Speaking of running backs, I'm gonna flip something here, but I want to ask your guys' opinion on how big of an impact Cedric Pierman's injury has on this team. And, he's kind of one of those locker room leader guys. You don't hear much about him because he doesn't put up a ton of stats, but he does everything the coaches ask of him. Connor, I'll start with you. Overall impressions of what this injury means to this team. Is it a huge blow? What do you think?
I think a vast majority of us NFL fans don't understand how impactful certain players can be on special teams, myself included. Luckily, I had a chance to watch just a couple of drills when I was at charter training camp, and I remember one of the stories that came out of it was that Melvin Gordon was taking snaps as a returner, but ultimately they weren't even testing him out as a returner. They were simply just getting an extra guy out there to catch punts while the blockers were practicing their blocking formations. And it was really interesting because I never really looked at, even considered the fact that special teamers, it's not just their running back, like in Madden, how the guy just runs straight backwards in a line, and then when the ball is caught, they run straight forwards. Like, there's 3 guys who try to build a wall in front of a running back. 2 guys will interlock arms, and the 3rd guy will, go on whatever side he's supposed to go on. And that's how they create a seam for the running back to go through. And Cedric Pierman was one of those guys who was really instrumental in generating a spot for Brandon Tate or whoever it was returning the kicks and the punts to go and get those positive yards. And then as a return man, I was reading stories about, I don't know if it was Pierman or another returner, but ultimately return guys, certain guys who are good players like Pierman is, get triple teamed on return coverage. So I think it's a huge loss for the Bengals. Not as a running back. I mean, he's not going to take more than 2 or 3 carries in the season. But as a return man, or not even a return, but like as a special teamer, you can't just teach a guy to do that. And I think Rex Burkhead's going to be the guy that replaces him in that spot. And ultimately, I think what's going to happen now is the team is going to have to make a decision. I don't think Trey Carson or Bronson Hill are ready to play that fourth spot, as you alluded to, AC. I think it's either going to be they roll with 3 running backs, which I think is a legitimate possibility, or they pick up potentially, I think, one of their former players, maybe a James Wilder Jr. Who looks kind of like on the roster bubble in Buffalo. I don't think Terrell Watson's going to get cut from Cleveland. Um, or maybe even a Dan Herron. I think Dan Herron is on the roster bubble. I'm pretty sure he's in Indianapolis right now. One of those former running backs. Or you keep a or a 10th defensive or fifth safety. I don't know exactly what the numbers would be. Jimmy Wilson seems like a guy who I don't know. I'm really not super 100% in tune with the special teams, but he seems. I've heard. I think that he has some sort of special teams experience. So I think ultimately, Cedric Pearman, we've always hailed him as this, amazing special teamer, saying, oh, we think he's worthy of Pro Bowls, and like, yeah, we see the tackles and stuff, but that's only half of his role in special teams. Half of it is also generating that seam for the return man to go through, and none of us, when we're watching returns, are watching them blockers. So I think it's going to be a huge impact. I hope that the Bengals are able. I think they've been one of the better special teams units over the past 4 or so years. I'm really hoping they can keep that up. And I'm not saying they won't be able to. I think Rex Burkhead's a really talented player, and I'm glad that the Bengals now finally have a role for him to play in. But I don't know, man. I think it's gonna be a bigger loss than people expect. Myself, I don't even know really what to expect. So
Scott, any additional thoughts on the Bengals losing the Pro Bowler Pearman?
Yeah, I think just to reiterate some of the things Connor said, I think a lot of us don't really take into account how valuable those positions are as far as everything they do. Because you look at what the Bengals have done on draft day, when some of the guys they've drafted, when they're picked, we're kind of like, why are you drafting this guy? Like James Wright was a perfect example. When they came out and said, well, we drafted him for special teams, they pretty much said that in the press conference.
Yep.
Because when he was at LSU, he really hadn't done anything. And we're like, well, why would you waste a pick on a special team guy? But they obviously know, the teams know better than the fans do. You just figure, oh yeah, this guy's a third string running back, fourth string running back. You just throw him on special teams, and obviously you just don't throw a guy on special teams. But they really have to have that ability, and there's a big difference between a guy who can really do it or just a guy that, yeah, he's a backup linebacker, just throw him out there and hope for the best. And so I think the Bengals put a lot of emphasis on that position, which is why they've kept Pyramid as long as they have, because you look at what they'd never hand him the ball. Like like Connor said, 2-3 times a year. So they're keeping him for that one reason, which is special. And Tate for the longest time, he had that one big catch last year. I think it's against Kansas City, and other than that, they insisted we're keeping him, but they wouldn't throw him the ball. So I think they put a lot of emphasis on special teams. So I think it's a big loss. As far as the two guys they have now, Carson and Hill, I am not sure if they're the answer on special teams. They're definitely not the answer at running back. I think Carson's averaging 2 yards a carry or just under that. Hill's averaging even less, like 1.5 yards a carry. So I don't think either one has really shown a whole lot running the ball, and catching the ball. I think Carson's caught like a third of his targets. So yeah, I don't think either one is probably going to be the answer. So what it comes down to, I wouldn't be surprised if one of them gets cut, and then on cut down day we grab, who knows who it would be. Probably someone who's a solid special teamer, but maybe like a fifth string running back somewhere that we add. So I think it's something that your average fan who watches the game isn't going to notice, but we might see it maybe in the stat, like as far as how well our return coverage does, or are we giving up a little more field position than normal? Is it something, there's kind of hidden yards we don't really think about, or kind of like with special teams with when Nugent misses a 40-yard field goal. Well, now you're starting, at your team starting the ball at the 40, 50-yard line. So those kind of little hidden things you don't think of. So I think the Bengals are probably much more worried about it than your average fan is, just because we just look at box scores and stats and okay, yeah, you don't see his name, so you really don't think. Kind of like the long snapper. Yeah, I'd venture many people in Paul Brown Stadium wouldn't know the guy's name, but obviously that's a good thing because if we knew his name, we'd be grumbling about him all the time.
Yep,
Clark Harris.
it is Clark Harris, but I think more
He's got
people
those
probably,
tattoos. That's my
yeah,
name.
more people would probably remember Brad St. Louis. Remember all those bad snaps a couple of years ago. More people are probably more familiar with Brad St. Louis than they are with the current long snapper Clark Harris. Good stuff, guys. Um, that being said, we're going to talk about some positions that um, are in flux because of cuts. And one of the cuts that occurred this week is one that a lot of fans, a lot of Bengals fans, have been waiting for at least a couple of years. I waver on this one a little bit in terms of my opinion, but the Bengals have released wide receiver and kick returner Brandon Tate. And there's kind of an ongoing joke between a lot of different blogs and Twitter and all this stuff about Brandon Tate. But when it's all said and done, the guy is the franchise career leader in punt return yardage. He's number 2 in kick return yardage in terms of franchise leaders, and he had the best single season punt return in terms of yardage in 2011 during a year when the team needed a lot of different players to help out as they were really in rebuild mode, and they ended up making the playoffs that year. So, Scott, I'm going to start with you. When you look back on Brandon Tate and his 5-year career in Cincinnati, is it a huge disappointment that everybody keeps kind of joking about and we should all be celebrating as some fans are now that Brandon Tate is gone? Or is it a guy who's a bit undervalued or somewhere in between?
As far as Tate, I think you really kind of have to look at the whole body of work. Kind of like you mentioned 2011. If you look at where the Bengals were in 2010, we had Quan Cosby returning kicks or returning punts. He was only averaging like 7 yards of return, and we had Bernard Scott returning kickoffs, and he was at 22 yards of return. And both those were pretty much bottom of the NFL. So Patriots get rid of Brandon Tate. He'd been fairly decent for them. Bengals at him, 2011. He had a great year, his best year returning punts, averaged like 10.5 yards per punt return in 2011. And kick return, he was pretty decent. I think it was right around 24 yards a carry. So back in 2011, it's like, wow, this is awesome. We haven't had a guy this good at returning who could do punt returns and kick returns at the same time. So when he came, I think a lot of us were pretty excited because it'd been a while since the Bengals really had a quality returner and one guy who could do both spots and do them competently. So I think a lot of us really like that. And it's kind of like when Nugent came. We were, a lot of people were pretty frustrated with Graham. He had missed a lot of key extra points and field goals that cost us some games. And Nugent's first year was really good. And he's kind of worn out his welcome. And I think the same thing happened with Tate. Yeah, he had that great first year. He never really replicated it. I think 2012, 13, 14 were, they weren't as good, but okay, weren't horrible. And then 2015, he was just awful last year. His punt return average was down like 6 yards a carry. His kick returns have been below 23 yards the last couple years. So I think that, it was definitely time to get rid of him, probably a year too late. And that just goes with the old adage, the NFL not for long, that, you have a window where, you're the guy for that window, but when your time's done, it's done. And I think a lot of the frustration with him is because, the last couple of years he probably wasn't worth that roster spot. But I think in that frustration, fans are probably overlooking that when he came here, he did have a few really good years, and he was a lot better. He was an upgrade over what we had. So I think we need to remember the good we had when he came and not just remember the end. So kind of like remembering, you have a guy who plays in your team forever. And okay, Anthony Munoz when he's 35 years old isn't the same guy when he's 25 or 30, but you don't remember him just for the last season. You have to look at that whole body, I think.
Right. And I think you made an excellent point about Tate being let go maybe a year too late. I think 2011 he had a pretty good season. 12 was but then he came back in 13 and actually had, again, one of the better punt return seasons in franchise history in 2013. So maybe you give him another year in 2014. It was subpar. Maybe that's when you cut the cord, and that's when the Bengals should have done it. Connor, you wrote a story about this week. You wrote a story about how Darren Simmons on Cincy Jungle, about how Darren Simmons, the special teams coach, has now basically given the punt return duty to Alex Erickson, the undrafted rookie free agent who has been outstanding this year, this preseason, I should say. And he's given the starting kick return duties, at least as of now, to Rex Burkhead. Now, I know there's a lot of cynicism with Brandon Tate, but neither of those guys have really returned kicks, at least not on a regular basis in the NFL and not in a regular season NFL game. Do you think that those two have the ability, from limited sample sizes, to be more effective than Brandon Tate, especially with maybe an Adam Jones mixing in there once in a while?
Yeah, just to clarify, I think Simmons. I mean, I really don't know exactly what he was meaning by this, but I'm pretty sure Erickson's going to be the guy to return both, and Burkhead's going to be more like he's going to be back there, kind of like how Peterman was back there and Tate was there.
Gotcha.
So, but just to I mean, it's definitely a concern. I think people are taking it for granted. What Brandon Tate brought to the team, he might not be the flashy man. Cordarrelle Patterson, but he's a guy where the Bengals just they seem to like to keep guys around just based on the special teams, like we were talking about with Pearman. Tate isn't just a guy who's only on the team for returns, and it's not even for take his receiving ability completely off the table, which he wasn't great, but he also played on I believe coverage, and they had Pearman and Tate, those two guys were two roster spots, and then you have 51 other spots or whatever for the rest of the team. So I think that what he brought, like you guys were kind of alluding to, is he brought that he was steady. He wasn't great, like we all know, and and at times he could have been a lot better if we would have liked to seen that. But I think what you kind of knew what you were going to get out of Tate, and that's what's scary heading into this season. I mean, this was the one year where I thought Brandon Tate was absolutely safe. Last year, I was like, okay, well, this has to be the year Brandon Tate gets cut. 2014, even though he's coming off a pretty good year, it was like, okay, well, he's been here for a while. There's mumbling starting to happen. This year, who was supposed to compete with him? No one like Mario Alford, and Mario Alford now is on injured reserve. So, and even before that, he wasn't playing very well. So, I think it's just kind of scary to look into the season. And granted, Erickson's been phenomenal throughout the preseason. He's averaging 40-something yards per punt return. He had 100-plus scrimmage yard or 100-plus all-purpose yards last game with a touchdown. He has, I think, 3 total touchdowns in the preseason, 2 receiving touchdowns and a punt return touchdown. He returned a kick for 31 yards against the Jags. He hasn't done anything wrong. Like, he's been as good as you could ever imagine. But at the same time, for me, it's hard to not just think of him as another Dane Sanzenbacher. Not because he's white, but just because he's just one of those preseason standouts where is that really going to translate to the regular season? And I'm not saying it's not going to, but it's definitely kind of scary to think about. Well, I think they probably did the move because they thought he was going to get stolen off of the practice squad if they try to keep him there. So they're going to promote him to the active roster probably, and they're probably going to dress him every single game. So I hope Erickson can play well. I'm pretty confident he will, but it's still, even as good as he's played, it's hard to not just have a little bit of a little just bit of fear. I mean, for lack of a better word.
Yeah, it's the devil you know versus the devil you don't, and the Bengals finally this year decided to go with the devil that you don't, based on the lack of experience with Alex Erickson and Rex Burkhead. But if it was going to, I mean. If there was a preseason performance that was ever going to usurp Brandon Tate as the return man, it's Alex Erickson's performances this year. He's been
can't play any better.
41.5 yards per punt return, I believe, is what he's averaging, which is just absolutely ridiculous. So I wish I had kind of the Oscars type of thing, but in memory of Brandon Tate as a Cincinnati Bengal from 2011 to 2016, Brandon Tate is officially gone. So some fans are celebrating. I think others are kind of saying, I think he was a little underappreciated. But Brandon Tate, nevertheless, is gone. So
for what it's worth, Simmons also mentioned, I believe, in the press conference, or it was Lewis, one of the two said, the door's still open for Tate if things aren't, if Erickson is a flash in the pan, then, you know.
Yep, or if they probably experience more injuries at wide receiver, he's probably someone that they would come knocking for. It's a good point, Connor. So we talked about the Pearman injury. We talked about Brandon Tate no longer being on the roster this week. I think we've started talking about it a little bit, so we don't need to dwell on it a ton. But those are the two positions that have really been. Well, running back now more recently, but wide receiver has really been under the microscope. So we'll start there since we just talked about Brandon Tate, and I just want to see if you guys have any disagreements on any of this. So between maybe cutting an unexpected guy, bringing one of those backup guys into the bottom end of the roster in the depth chart at their position, or scouring the waiver wire for additions. What do you guys think on? First of all, we'll start with receiver, and Scott, I'll start with you. I have six. The six guys making it are Green, AJ Green, Tyler Boyd, Brandon LaFell, Alex Erickson now, Cody Core, and James Wright. Those are the six guys that I have. Do you disagree with that? Do you see one of those guys you were talking about earlier, Jake Humerow, Rashawn Simon, sneaking onto the back end of that position?
I'd say that sounds about right from my perspective, and one of the reasons I'd say that is a article that got published today that I wrote was talking about the wide receiver group, and I think I had those exact same in there. AJ, LaFell, and Boyd, I think, are the three clear locks. I think Erickson and Cody Core, and then Wright are the other three I had in there. And then I don't want to write off Russell right away, but I'm assuming he's not going to make it. Simonize and Kumaro, I think, are.
Well, Russell's going to start, right? according to Connor's followers.
I'm not a sage, so he is 6'4", so I guess you could say him, Simonize, and Kumaro are fighting for that same position. Of those three, I'm guessing Kumaro and Simonize, they try to stick on the practice squad. I just out of part of me just sees them not giving Kumaro any chance in preseason, maybe because they're trying to hide him. I don't know if that actually works in this modern age of computers and internet. If you can actually hide a guy like that and just say, well, we're not playing him, so no one sees him, we can stick him on the practice squad again. So that might be what they're doing with Jake. I'm not really sure. And then Simonize, since I think no one really drafted him after the that supplemental draft, so I'm guessing he's probably one they feel they can stick on the practice squad, probably clears waivers. I don't think anyone would want to put him on the 53-man roster, and I don't think anything would happen like Tampa Bay did with Briscoe a couple years ago, where they sign him to a active roster salary, putting him on the practice squad. So I think Simonize is probably bound for the practice squad. Kumaro probably is, and yeah, outside of Russell starting, the only exception I could see to that, as you kind of alluded to, would be if we grab another veteran, someone who maybe has 3-4 years, been around the league for a while, kind of a career backup or an older guy who, pretty much what we did with LaFell, someone that, okay, he's not going to be elite, but someone to throw in there until we feel that these other guys are ready. Because something with Erickson, he just kind of reminds me of Quan Cosby, who was an undrafted guy. He came into, it was back in 09 or whatever it was, came into camp. There weren't really any expectations, and all of a sudden he wins a roster spot, has a great first year as a returner. I think he averaged like 12 yards a return back in 09. And yeah, just was this incredible flash in the pan, just wow, this guy's great. And then after that kind of fizzled and disappeared. So I think the fear of Erickson possibly doing that, I'm not sure if they would put all their eggs in the Erickson basket without having anything there to back him up, because Core's a rookie. James Wright's been hurt a couple times. So I'd say there's got to be an outside chance that they pick someone up, but based on who they have now, I think those are the six: Core, Erickson, Wright, and then the three that we know are going to be on the roster.
Yeah. Connor, do you think the team, is there any chance the team decides, because they like these young guys, the Ericksons, Core has really been impressive as well. Not a lot of people are talking about him because of Erickson's performances, but Core I've been really impressed with. Is there a chance that a guy has both an ability to play some receiver and help out on special teams, and maybe is floating out there after final cuts or something like that. Do you think they take a chance on maybe someone that's out there and use them in place of a James Wright or a Cody Core?
I don't really think. Are you talking about veteran pickups potentially?
Yes.
Um, I wouldn't say that it's probably gonna. I think, like Scott kind of
Also
mentioned,
because of the inexperience in the group.
I mean, yeah, that's fair. And obviously LaFell with him, it's still pretty much up in the air whether he's going to play or not. I think ultimately the X factor is going to be whether LaFell is going to be healthy for the season. And obviously he's trying to work through his hand injury, which is definitely admirable. But at the end of the day, he's still hurt and he's playing through that. So I think ultimately it's going to come down to, like I think like you guys were kind of were alluding to, is the guys that are going to make the team, right? AJ, Cody Core, Tyler Boyd, LaFell, Wright, and then Erickson. And I think that they're all almost pretty much set in stone. I would say the one guy that is really subject to change is just basically LaFell, because everyone else has a role on the team already. LaFell, the only thing would be, is he going to be healthy? I don't think they'll go 7 wide receivers and only keep 3 running backs. I think the option of 3 running backs is a possibility, but I don't think they're going to spend a 7th roster spot on a wide receiver just to keep another guy inactive. And if we're gonna go down this route with the whole, is there a guy to pick up? Like I said, I think it's going to take a LaFell opting to surgery or something like that along those lines for that to happen, or one of the other guys getting hurt. But the guys that are on the market are Ruben Randall, who had struggles learning the Giants playbook. Didn't He has physical specimen type of attribute towards him, and he put up big numbers last year. I think he had like 8 touchdowns and 700 something yards. But it'd be definitely hard to envision him learning a playbook in 2 weeks and being ready for the season. Another guy could be maybe a Chris Givens, who's bounced around certain rosters over the past couple of years. He could be a good deep threat. I don't know if he's good at special teams or not, but he's a guy who would have a little bit of speed to take the top off of a defense if Wright or Core wasn't able to do that. And then the final guy I would throw out is Josh Boyce, who isn't really anyone. He was a mid-round pick, I believe, in 2013. But more people might know him as a former college teammate of Andy Dalton, who back when they were at TCU was a pretty impact player in his first year on the team, which was incidentally Dalton's last year on the team. And I don't think that's going to be a huge impact or anything like that, but who knows? Maybe Marvin Lewis and Duke Tobin trust Dalton as a guy who could potentially say, you know what, I like Boyce. I used to throw to him in college. Let's take a shot on it. And again, I think that's only going to happen if someone gets hurt. But for now, I think they're pretty set on who they've got.
Yeah, and I think the 6 that I mentioned and that we're all pretty much in the agreement with, it sounds like based on what Wright can do in special teams as opposed to maybe what Core can do, sounds like Wright would maybe be more active if they keep 5 active wide receivers, which is what they usually do on game days. You keep Core there, maybe he mixes in there every once in a while, but that's who we think are the 6 wide receivers. Really quick short answer here, Scott. I'm going to give you 3 options for the final running back spot, because we talked about this already a little bit with Cedric Pierman's injury. Is the 4th running back? Here's your options, and just give me a quick answer. He's not here yet, and they're going to pick one up off of waivers. One of the guys that are already here, and they're gonna keep one of the guys that they have, or they're only going to keep 3 running backs this year.
I just can't believe it's one of the guys they have here. So I'm going to say he's not here yet. One way or the other, either via trade or cut down day pickup.
Okay. I don't know. I'll say it's a guy. I think it's a guy that is not here yet as well. I think I think they're going to probably sniff around on waivers. There might be some guys I think Shane Vereen was recently released. He could be a guy that knows the Patriot way and all of that. So he could be a guy that they look at. So that's kind of where we're looking at with the running backs now as we go forward, and those are some of our roster predictions for a couple of positions that are pretty interesting right now. So, guys, we have a hater of the week. We haven't had one for I think a week or two now. So we have a new hater of the week, and it's so easy to point out someone who is affiliated with the Steelers or someone who is not is has allegiance to the Steelers, that sort of thing. But we didn't get to this last week because of a lot of other news, but we have to talk about it now because Vontez Perfect has now chimed in. Connor, the hater of the week right now is Steelers linebacker Ryan Shazier, and the reason why he's the hater of the week is he's still plugging the Ravens rivalry with the Steelers as the utmost importance, and he's kind of poo-pooing the rivalry with the Bengals, especially over the past couple of years, and all of the chippiness, all of the injuries, that sort of thing. What do you think about Shazier's comments and Burfict's comments that he I'll say it nicely for the kids who may be listening, he doesn't care about the Steelers. So there's kind of Burfict's response was a little bit like Shazier's initial comments.
Yeah, honestly, I wasn't really sure why we covered the whole story just because I think it's kind of going back and forth. And Shazier's comments just kind of sound like a guy. They're coming from a guy who leads with his head a little bit too much. So, yeah, I'll just throw that joke in there. But I mean, I don't know. At the end of the day, it's just talk. It's just two guys going back and forth, and they're trying to be the more manly guy between the two and say, oh, I've I don't know. I've laid the wood or I've made the plays, whatever it is. Ultimately, Pittsburgh's 2 games with Cincinnati are another 2 games on their schedule. Cincinnati's 2 games with Pittsburgh are another 2 games on their schedule. The Bengals last year lost to the Steelers twice. The Steelers lost to the Ravens twice. The Ravens lost to the Bengals twice. That's just the cycle of the AFC North. You just got to focus on the games you can win. And for both of those guys, I just think they're taking it week to week. I remember hearing one of the guys that I was around with San Diego getting interviewed, and they were asking him, what do you think about this preseason game? He says, I'm looking forward to Kansas City, who is the team they're playing in week 1. And that was like 6 or 7 weeks before the season even started. It's pretty incredible to think that all these guys just have week 1 on their mind. So, I mean, Shazier's comments, yeah, they're kind of like dumb and they're haterish. And Perfects are the exact same way. I don't really take much out of this.
Yeah, and it's interesting that they both play linebacker and they're both kind of that more physical position on the field, and obviously Shazier was responsible for Giovanni Bernard getting hurt in that playoff game due to a helmet-to-helmet hit. Scott, any additional thoughts? He's an Ohio State boy, and he's kind of saying that they don't really think about the Steelers don't really think about the Bengals as much as the Ravens in terms of rivalry.
I think one interesting thing, I was just looking up the definition of rival, and a rival is someone who attempts to equal or surpass and pursues the same objective. And since the Bengals tend to be winning the AFC North, I think I agree, Shazier, that, yeah, they're both fighting for second place. So in that regard, they are rivals. Pittsburgh and Baltimore are rivals fighting for, to see who can finish second. So, yeah.
I like it.
In that regard, I have to agree with them. They are rivals. And he was an Ohio State guy. I know there's a lot of I know inside Cincinnati you don't have a lot of Ohio State fans, but I think everywhere in Ohio outside of Cincinnati you do. So there's a lot of dual Bengal Buckeye fans who like Shazier, although I think he was only there a couple years and then he left early. So he's probably been out of Ohio State almost as long as he's been in there. So I think at that point the fans who are dual fans are probably now siding more with the Bengals and probably getting tired of him, especially after his when he speared Giovanni Bernard in that playoff game. But yeah, I think it's one of these things where he's only saying it to say it because he knows it's going to get attention,
Yeah.
for Shazier to say, oh yeah, they're not our rival. But you look at who are they playing in the playoffs? They're not playing Baltimore. Baltimore have won 4, 5, 6 games, and they're not projected to do much better this year. But and he wasn't there when Baltimore was good. Shazier was probably in junior high last time when Baltimore had those great defenses. So, for him to say one team's a rival or not, he's probably never played against Baltimore when they were a good team. So it's just Yeah, it's going to stir the pot, and I think they're both doing that. You had the guy from the Steelers tweeting, "Oh, we can't, we um, are really hoping to play the Bengals in the playoffs," and yeah, it's just a back and forth thing, and I just kind of take it as, yeah, whatever. He's just trying to stir the pot. He knows it's going to get people riled up, and he's I assume Shazier is a follower of our podcast, and he's probably trying to
No, for
get
sure.
attention on here. There's people who are trying to get fame, so he's trying to get famous through us. So, and here we go. We went and fed him.
Yep, he was gunning for this week's hater of the week for sure,
Yep,
and
and he played
it's
right into it.
yep, we really did, and
They just want some. They want some airtime, man.
the you know the cynic or a Steelers fan would respond probably to you, Scott, in the way of a rivalry would be where the teams kind of evenly play each other, beat each other a lot. Even though the Bengals are winning a lot of games, they're not winning a lot of games against the Steelers, unfortunately. So even though it's probably just a little bit of a jab at Bengals fans and the Bengals team, um, it's the Bengals have to start beating Pittsburgh in games and in meaningful games for that rivalry to really, really take center stage, even though it did after that wild card game with all the physicality. But that being said, Ryan Shazier, linebacker of the Pittsburgh Steelers, you are the hater of the week, and you have joined the likes of Colin Cowherd of Fox Sports, Frank Schwab of Yahoo Sports, John Breach of CBS Sports, and all the great, great haters of the Bengals. So good job, Ryan Shazier. We are going to close up shop with one final segment, and we started this last week. It's called What If? And if you've been following the NFL news, aside from the great coverage we're providing at Cincy Jungle, you would have known that Teddy Bridgewater, the Minnesota Vikings quarterback, had a gruesome, gruesome injury at practice, non-contact. I believe it was a torn ACL and dislocated kneecap. Luckily, no further damage, no arterial damage, any of that stuff. Had to be taken out off the field in an ambulance. It was pretty serious stuff. And if you know about Bridgewater and following, he's a great guy, great kid, a high character guy. So get well soon to Teddy Bridgewater, especially with Mike Zimmer, who all Bengals fans love as the head coach over there in Minnesota. But Connor, there's a couple of schools of thought here. If you want to be greedy, the Bengals should think about the option of trading AJ McCarron, who has had an outstanding preseason along with Andy Dalton, and looks to really have grown even more so than some of the good performances we saw at the end of last year. You could probably get a high draft pick, especially with some of these quarterback-needy teams, Denver Broncos, Minnesota Vikings, that sort of thing, as the season opens. You could probably get a pretty lucrative offer from these teams if you wanted to. If you want to be greedy and you feel like your team's pretty deep, that's one option. The other option is you look at last year and you see that Andy Dalton, who is normally very healthy, was injured last year, and the Bengals needed a capable starter to come in, not only lead them into the playoffs, but have them almost win a playoff game. Even though McCarron didn't play great, he did enough to win that game. So, what if, Connor, the Vikings call and want to give the Bengals a lucrative offer for AJ McCarron? Do you say yes or do you say no?
I mean, if the Vikings do it, then yeah. But I mean, this is just a kind of fantasy land scenario. I'm sure every team does its due diligence, but at the end of the day, I'm sure. And that being said, I'm assuming that I'm sure the Bengals have contacted the Vikings about some sort of potential trade offer for AJ McCarron, even though Marvin Lewis said, no, we're not going to do that. And ultimately, what it comes down to is, what is AJ McCarron's value? And to the Bengals, like we saw, I mean, people are going to say he won the playoff game. People are going to say he didn't win the playoff game. He didn't play that well. But that aside, he might be the most valuable backup quarterback in the entire NFL. And how valuable is a backup quarterback? Because as we saw, Brock Osweiler signed a huge deal to go play for Houston, to start for them after playing probably, I think, 5 or 6 games in his Broncos career as a starter.
And he got benched.
He got benched, and they won in the game that he got benched against San Diego, in the game that if San Diego had held on, the Bengals would have had that first round bye, which we were all aspiring to have. And that was crazy because that game, man, I could go on about that game for such a long time. Because Peyton Manning didn't come in and do anything differently. All he did was just read opposing defenses better and check into a better run play than the run play they were already probably going to run. He didn't pass well at all. But ultimately, what it comes down to is McCarron has value. The Bengals know that. His value is only going to go up if he's sitting on the bench. So why trade him now when there's going to be a team that comes around? I think he's under contract through 2018. I'm pretty sure. Maybe it's through 2017, but regardless, we have him on the team for the next, we have him for a while. So his value is only going to appreciate. The only way I trade him is for a high draft pick. I think if we sit back, let him play out his entire rookie contract, he's not ever going to re-sign Cincinnati unless Andy Dalton gets hurt, plays terrible, or gets cut for whatever reason, which I don't think any of those three things are going to happen. So the only way that we're looking at keeping AJ McCarron is if Andy Dalton, for whatever reason, is not on the team any longer, which, like most people probably assume, is not going to happen. That being said, if he signs in free agency, the Bengals are going to get a comp pick, assuming they don't sign a big free agent, which is probably a safe assumption because they rarely sign big free agents. So then you're looking at, okay, well, what compensation or compensatory pick are we looking at? And I would say, I don't know, Osweiler, I think, netted his team a third rounder or a fourth rounder. Let's just say devil's advocate here that McCarron's ceiling is a fourth round compensatory pick. So right now he's worth that already. So he's worth a fourth rounder. Just we're going to get a fourth rounder for him down the road, and we're also in the meantime going to have the best backup quarterback in the NFL until then. So what is how much higher do you have to go than a fourth rounder for the trade to really pay off? And for me, it has to be at the minimum a high second rounder, probably plus a late pick if it's a second rounder, or a first rounder of any value. And I don't think the Vikings are going to give up a first rounder for a guy to compete with Bridgewater. And that's really, I mean, I would love for Minnesota to send us a first rounder and a couple of late picks for McCarron. But what does that say about an organization who has just lamented the absence of Bridgewater as a guy who they believe is their future? And for what it's worth, I don't think they're really going to do anything. I mean, we saw they cut Brad Sorensen, who was their, I think, number 3 quarterback at the time, the day before Bridgewater got hurt. And then as soon as he got hurt, he took a plane back to Minnesota right from where he was headed, which would be an awesome. I mean, it would suck to the guy who's looking to hold on to a roster spot. It must feel so good to have that at first have that uncertainty about where am I going to go, and then the next day get a call and say, hey, you're back in Minnesota.
So Scott, the Bengals are a conservative franchise, and Connor obviously said this is kind of fantasy land stuff, and in a way it is. This is kind of Madden franchise mode. You move and shake, but at the same time, I mean, obviously, a first-round pick that's just not going to happen. A second-round pick is possible, but probably far-fetched. You're probably looking at a third-round pick, maybe a pick and a player, that sort of thing. The Bengals are a conservative franchise. They saw what happened last year. They saw what happened with Teddy Bridgewater this year, and now the situation Minnesota is in without having a capable backup. So do you roll the dice and you say, Andy Dalton, who's basically been healthy up until 4 games last season, do you roll the dice and say, we're putting all our eggs in the Andy Dalton basket and kind of getting greedy and get what we need, or do you play it conservative? What if the Vikings call and want a lucrative trade for AJ McCarron?
I'd say you look at what is the most important position on the football field today, and it's quarterback. Starting quarterback. Second most important position might be backup quarterback, as we saw last year. If they call, I think I say, yeah, that's nice. Unless you're giving us, an RG3 type of Jared Goff type of offer or something near there, it's not happening. And the reason is you look at someone like the Cowboys. 2 years ago, they were 12-4. They were one of the best teams in the NFL. Last year, Romo gets hurt, and they just go to crap.
Yeah.
Bridgewater gets hurt, and he's not even a big. Bridgewater threw for like what 3,300 yards. He's not even a big passing quarterback, and all of a sudden, as soon as he gets hurt, it's like season's over, season's over. We were going to be playoff bound and go deep, and now we're going to be in last place. And same with the Cowboys again this year with Rome. And yeah, it's just I think you just if you can get a second quarterback, especially when we got McCarron on the cheap as a late draft pick, and I think normally you get those picks for like 4 years, and he's in like what year 3. So I'd say if anything, you if I was the Bengals, and granted I'm not, but if I was, if Mike Brown were to call me and say, hey, I'm making you GM, well, first that'd be cool. I'd have to move again. But besides that, I think one thing I'd look at was let's wait till his last year, because that way you can kind of plan for it. Like right now, if he goes out, we have Keith Wenning or a guy we're going to pick up off the street. And if Dalton goes down, we're in the same situation they are. So I would not give that up unless you're giving me one heck of an offer. But teams have been known to make silly offers. Kevin Kolb, I think, sat in Philadelphia forever, and they waited till a team was desperate, and I forget what they got for him, but they got a ton. And that the Flynn,
Matt Flynn
from Green Bay to Seattle, he got it. They got it. So I'm thinking you can get, if you have a team desperate enough. So the Vikings only need a guy for a year. The Cowboys, if they aren't convinced Dak Prescott's the answer, they might be more willing to call you because Romo's getting old. That's a second major injury. If they don't think Prescott's going to be ready for a couple of years, and they're kind of an SEC country, so they might have more of a interest in someone like McCarron, maybe they call and offer you a first and a second. But if you're not giving me at least, and like we said, it's probably not going to happen. So if they're not going to give me something that high, which is pretty much what a good, you look at a team like the Browns, who always lose, versus a team. If you give the Browns a decent quarterback, they probably go from a 3-4 win team to a 7 or 8 win team. So those wins are worth, that's got to be worth something. And just because of the first round pick doesn't mean it's always going to be good, because the Browns, they obviously don't use them all very well. So I would want more in return. I'd say if you're going to give me a third or fourth, don't even bother calling me. If you're going to give me a first or a couple seconds or something, okay, yeah, let's discuss this, because then you can use those picks to replace McCarron. But if you're going to give me a fourth-round pick or a third-round pick, I'd probably just hang up the phone, or I'd probably be really I might just hang it up. I might kindly hang it up, or say, oh, I can't hear you, fuzz, static, I can't hear you, and then hang up.
I'm going in a tunnel.
Yep.
Yeah.
Put in a cup of water.
Yeah. So here's the thing, okay? I'm kind of in agreement with both of you guys. It would need to be a lucrative offer, and it would need to be something that really blew the Bengals' hair back in terms of what a team would offer. But you have to remember, in 2011, the Bengals went into the season with Andy Dalton, who looked terrible in the preseason and was a second-round pick, and not a bunch of people thought he would amount to anything. And Bruce Gradkowski, Carson Palmer, that was floating out there, and he said he was not going to play for the Bengals, even with that attitude. And granted, he was a number 1 overall pick, not a fifth-round pick like A.J. McCarron. But you had a team
national champion A.J. McCarron.
Yeah, you had a team that got desperate right before the trade deadline, that thought they were close enough in terms of their roster. You had a coach at the time, Hugh Jackson, who was very close to Marvin Lewis. You have to understand, Mike Zimmer has a similar relationship to Marvin Lewis in the Cincinnati Bengals. And now many people had the Vikings winning the NFC this year with Teddy Bridgewater healthy. If the Vikings feel that they're that close and they offer something that's crazy, like what the Raiders did to get Carson Palmer, I don't think you can hang up the phone. But as we saw, and as we're seeing around the league, if you don't have a starting quarterback that can come in and win games, or at least game manage a team that is Bengals, you're in trouble, and you're not going to win the games that you should win. And so it is a razor's edge to walk, and I think the Bengals would be hard pressed if the Vikings come calling and offer a very lucrative deal for A.J. McCarron this year. And with waiver wire cuts and all of that thing, the Bengals could potentially add in a backup quarterback. So it is a far-fetched scenario, but it's not maybe as far-fetched as some of the things we have been asked and heard of from Bengals fans over the years in our coverage of the team.
Well, I
That's
think if it's
yeah,
the Vikings, you have to look at if they are that good, it's going to be a late pick too. So I think you'd have to ask for more because a first round pick, from a team that finishes in the playoffs isn't quite the same thing as getting a first round pick from the Rams or the Browns or something.
yep, yep, definitely. That's gonna wrap it up for the Orange and Black Insider. That was our what if segment, but that's gonna wrap up this show, episode number 6. We're heading into the home stretch of preseason and into the regular season. I didn't mention this before, but you can follow us on Twitter at BengalsOBI. You can check out our material, our podcast on CincyJungle.com. You can also find us on iTunes, the Orange and Black podcast on iTunes. Rate the show, leave a review, all of that good stuff. We love the feedback. You can also email us at theobinsider@gmail.com. So get a hold of us in any one of those means. We also have our own personal Twitter accounts, and you can contact us through the website and all of that good stuff. But for episode 6 of the Orange and Black Insider, I'm Anthony Cosenza. Thank you to Connor Howe and Scott Schultze. Hoo day, guys.
Good
Good
day.
day.